In this second eye lesson, we're going to take a look at more complex eye rigs, specifically eyes with separate pupils and eye whites and eyelids for blinks. Now we're going to start with a simpler version of this rig with Hipsterman Rig 1. And then in Hipsterman Rig 2, we're going to look at adding another level of expressive control over the eyes. So let's start with Rig 1 here. Now we're starting again with a character with a full body rig. And to save a little time, we've already added our eye aim control, although it hasn't been hooked up yet. We used exactly the same procedure of just creating the aim control, positioning it out in front of the character, parenting it to the head, and then zeroing it out. So just the same as what we did in the first eye lesson. No surprises there. Now there are some differences with the artwork setup here. So let's unshy our layers and let's scroll down to our head comp here. Let's unlock that and double click on it. And you can see once again that within our head pre-comp, we have all of our different facial feature parts. And in this case, of course, we have separate eye whites and pupils for both eyes. And then we also have a sequence of layers that will create an eye closing and an eye opening. So in this case, we have 4 eyelids for each eye that go from partially closed to all the way closed. Now before we get started, just to keep things a little more organized, let's select all of the right eye pieces and let's color them red for the right side. And then let's select our left eye pieces and color them purple for the left side, just to help keep things straight as we're working here. Now the first thing we need to do is add our eye aim control, and this is essentially going to be exactly the same as what we did for our dot or button eyes. Although in this case we don't need to add the additional nulls for each pupil as we did in that first lesson. Now the reason why we don't need those additional nulls on the pupils in this case is that if you recall in the first lesson, the reason we added those null objects to the pupils and parented the pupils to those nulls was so that we could have that split of the squash and stretch blink control that blinked both eyes, and then right and left squash and stretch wink controls for each individual eye. In this case, we're going to be creating our blinks with this eyelid artwork, not with that kind of squash and stretch control. So that means it's not necessary for us to have those additional nulls for these more complicated eyes with the separate eye whites and eyelid art. So in this case, within our Create Controllers tab, we just need to create that single null. And we'll call that eye control. And we just need to zero out that position, again, not with the add zero script, just by turning the position value to 0. That'll move that null up into the corner. Then we're going to take both our right and left pupils, and we're going to parent those both to that eye control null. And then we're going to go ahead and zero out both of these position values on these individual pupils so we can add our individual pupil control just like we did with our individual eye position controls in our first lesson. Let's go ahead now and split our timeline window by dragging our head comp down and dropping it down to the bottom. We'll go back to the Hipsterman Rig 1. Select the eye aim control and the P key for its position, and then grab our eye control null inside our head comp and hit P for position. And again, we're going to grab the property pick whip, or if you're using an older version of After Effects, option click and use the expression pick whip. We're just going to pick whip this position to that position to hook up our eye aim control. Remember again that initially this eye aim control is going to be too wild and crazy, so we need to tune it. So let's come into the head comp, open the expression window here, and then grab that expression, jump to the end of that expression code, and we're going to divide this again by 4. So / for divide by 4 to make that a quarter of the value of the eye aim control. So now we get that easier to control ratio between these within the eye, as if the eyelid is cutting it off. So here's a good example of the difference here. This is definitely a very strong look. It's more cartoony. It's more broad. This is a little more realistic. So let's go ahead and do this with the other eye. Let's grab the left eye white, duplicate it, rename it, move that on top, and add our alpha matte. So now both of our eyes stay inside or behind the eyelids. All right, now we're ready to add some blink controls. To start with, let's add some slider controls to the eye aim control. So we're going to select that eye aim control, go under Effect, and let's add a slider. We'll call that right blink, and then we'll duplicate that to make a left blink. Now note that I'm not making a single individual blink control. Now that's because with this particular rig setup, you can create a single slider that will control both eyes. But if you want individual control so the character can also wink, and you can have individual blink control over both eyes, it gets a little complicated to try to rig both. Now once we're done here, we'll talk about how you can do that. It's not that complicated, but it's complicated enough that for this lesson, we're just going to do a right and a left control so we have individual control over both eyes. And then when you want to just do a standard blink where you blink both eyes, you'll just have to animate these two properties, which isn't really that big a deal. In the first lesson, it's really very easy to rig both a single blink control and individual blink controls because of the way that rig is set up. In this case, it's just a little more complicated to try to do both. Now we'll actually set the limits on these sliders a little later once we've had a look at our artwork. But we will go over to the eye aim control, hit the E key, and then tab open these two blink controls so we can see those sliders. Now back inside the head comp here, we have these little sequences of eyelids. And just like we did with our hand selectors, we're simply going to set up a replacement rig in order to select these eyelids in sequence to close and open the eye. So we'll do the right first, and then we'll kind of speed through the left. But the first thing we want to do is select the 4 eyelids. Let's go ahead and turn their visibility on. And we're just going to pre-comp these. So let's go under Layer, Pre-compose, and we'll call this Right Eyelids Comp. Now, if I was really concerned about performance, I could duplicate one of these eyelids before I pre-comped and cropped it down, but this head comp is already fairly small, so I'm not going to worry about it too much, but we could, of course, crop this if we needed to. Now, we already know how to create a replacement rig with our connector since we did that with the hands. But there's one little issue here we have to kind of think through, and that's that unlike the hands, when our slider is at the 0 position, we don't want any of these eyelids showing. With the hands, when we were at 0, we wanted our neutral hand. But our neutral position for these eyes is no eyelids at all. So the eye is fully open. Now that's going to depend to some degree on your character design. Some character designs might have a little bit of eyelid showing in their neutral. Our hipster character, however, should have no eyelids showing for his neutral, fully open eye. So if we were just to go ahead and rig up this sequence, the problem would be that at 0 we would be showing eyelid 1, which even though it's a small eyelid is still a little bit of eyelid showing. So we want to make sure that our first frame in our little sequence is a blank frame. So to do that, let's just throw a null object in here. So we could just grab a null from the layer menu. I'm just going to go ahead and grab one here from the controller menu in Duik since I've got this open. And we'll just name this blank. And put that down at the bottom of our stack. So the only purpose for this is just to have an empty frame when our slider is at 0. Now we can go ahead and go through our connector steps. So let's go to our connector. Let's select the right blink slider here. Pick that as our master property. Now our maximum value is going to be 40 because at 0 it's going to be blank, and then 10, 20, 30, 40. So our maximum value is going to be 40. And then we're going to select our eyelids in order. So from the blank to eyelid 4, and then connect to opacities. Now when we go back to our eye controller, let's tab open our slider here, and let's now limit our slider also. So our slider is limited to 40. And then now when we turn the slider all the way up, the character's eye closes, and when we slide it back down, it opens back up again. Now the more pieces of eyelid art you have, the slower you can open and close your eyes. In this particular case, our blinks are going to have to be fairly fast, but we also have the option of doing, for example, half-lidded eyes if our character is sleepy, so it gives us another level of expressive control as well as allowing us to simply blink or wink the eye. Now the other thing you can consider here is to have different types of eyelid shapes, like for example a mad eyelid that's sort of pointed down in the middle, or a sad eyelid tilted up, or even a black and blue eyelid if a character has a black eye. So you can have a standard blink, but then you can have other expressive eyelids in your system as well if you need them. Let's go ahead and set up the left eyelid quickly. Just walk through this procedure one more time. So we're going to go back into the head comp. I'm going to turn on our 4 eyelid pieces here, select them, pre-compose them. I'm going to add our null object to be our blank. Move that down to the bottom of the stack. Then we're going to select our left blink slider, go to our connector, choose that as the master property, set the maximum for 40, and then select our layers from the bottom to the top in order, and then connect to opacities. Now once again, our left blink slider will now blink our left eye. Whoops, and we need to limit our slider here. There we go. Okay, so let's close our extra windows here and just clean up a little bit. Let's also clean up our effects controls a little. We can move our controller down to the bottom, close up the slider connector, and I'm going to put the 2 blink controls over the individual pupil controls because we're much more likely to use those a lot more often than we'll use the individual pupil control. And let's unlock our effect control window. Okay, so we've got a really nice control here for these eyes. They can look around. They stay within the eyes because of those track mats, which of course is optional, but you have that option if you need it. And we can wink or blink one or both eyes as we need them. You can also have sort of half-lidded eyes, so we have that additional level of expressive control. Now, just really quickly, if you did want to have an individual blink slider that would blink both eyes, and then individual wink sliders for right and left, with this kind of a rig, what you would have to do is duplicate the 2 eyelid precomps. So you would have 2 eyelid precomps for the right and 2 eyelid precomps for the left. You would rig one set of right and left eyelids to a single slider to blink both eyes, and then rig the other 2 individually to wink sliders. And then you'd be able to blink the character with one slider and then wink the character with 2 individual sliders. It's certainly possible to do that. It's a nice level of control. Maybe not entirely necessary, but if you're going really all out for a rig, that's how you would set that up. Now remember, in our first eye lesson, our eye blinks, quote unquote, were really squash and stretch controls on the individual little eye shapes. Now that made a lot of sense for those simple button eyes, but obviously it doesn't make any sense to squash and stretch just a pupil floating in an eye. There's not really anything to be gained by doing that. However, having some squash and stretch control over the eye itself does allow you some nice expressive capability. There are muscles around the human eye that allow you to kind of squint, which is partly an eyelid thing, but it's also about the muscles around the eye, or open the eyes very wide in surprise. So a squash and stretch control over the entire eye rig is a nice level of control to have, but it does require a little bit of a different setup. It's a little more complicated. So let's go ahead to Hipster Man Rig 2, and let's take a look at how we can add that kind of squash and stretch control to our eyes. Now once again, we've got a full body rig here. Once again, we've already added the eye control, and we've actually added all of the effect controls that we're going to need for this. And we've actually got some of the rigging already done. So both blinks are already working. So we have blink control for both the right and left eye that are already functioning. And we've actually fully rigged the right eye entirely. So this is going to look a little strange because we haven't hooked up the left eye yet, but you can see we have the eye aim control for the right eye. And we also have the squash and stretch control already rigged up for the right eye. So let's take a look at what we're going to get once we finish with the left eye. So as I slide down on the slider, the eye squishes, and as I slide up on the slider, the eye stretches. And what's awesome about this is that everything works with it. So my eye aim control, including the individual pupil control, works with it. And the blinks work with it as well. So the blinks are all part of the whole system. So I can open and close and aim the eye and squash and stretch it all at the same time. So this is a really nice expressive eye rig, and it just takes a little additional work to set it up. So let's go ahead and look at how this is put together. So we'll unshy our layers and once again go down to our head comp for this rig. And let's unlock our layers for our left eye and get that left eye rigged up. Again, we've already got the eyelids pre-composed and rigged for the eye blinks. We've also already got our eye white mats in place for both eyes, so we don't need to do that. So we're just going to focus on what it's going to take to hook up the eye aim controls and then add the squash and stretch control. So first, we're going to select the left pupil. We're going to go into our Create Controllers tab, and we're going to make a control null at that same anchor point. Let's drag that down. We got to put that on top of the eye white mat. We can't put it over the pupil because otherwise that'll interrupt our alpha track mat. So we'll put that there above the eye white mat. And let's turn that purple just so it matches our other left eye layers. And then we're going to create another controller. Let's select the eye white layer and let's create yet another null controller. Let's move that down underneath all of our eye pieces here. We'll color it purple again. And let's rename this left eye squash stretch. Now I selected the eye white layer because that puts us close to where we want this null, but I'm going to move it. I'm going to pick it up and move it down to around the lower quarter of the eye, and I'm going to center it just a little bit more so it's kind of near the bottom but not all the way to the bottom of the eye. This of course is going to be the anchor point from which we squash and stretch. So we don't want it at the very bottom, but we don't want it right in the middle either. We want it near the bottom. So most of the movement is happening in the top part of the eye. Now let's do a little parenting to kind of connect this all up. So first we want the pupil to be parented to the pupil control. We can parent the eye white matte right to the eye white since they're essentially the same layer. Then we need the eyelid comp, the pupil controller, and the eye white layers all together, and we want to parent those all to the squash and stretch null. So basically all of our eye layers are all ultimately parented to this squash and stretch null. Now in order to hook up our aim controls, we're going to go first to our pupil control null, and we're going to zero that out. And then we're going to go to our pupil artwork layer, and we're also going to zero that out as well because we need that for the individual eye control. Now note that one of the significant differences here is we don't have a single eye control null that both pupils are parented to. Each pupil has to have its own eye control null. We've already connected the right pupil control to the eye aim control, and now we'll connect the left pupil control to that eye aim control. So the result will be the same, that the eye aim control will move around both pupils. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to click and drag the head comp down and split our timeline here. We'll go to Rig 2. Select the eye aim control, hit the P key to open that position value, and then we'll take the left eye pupil control and pick whip that right to that position control, just like we did in the previous lesson. And just like we've done before, let's tune this, tweak this. So I'm going to select the expression code, go to the end of the code, \4 to make that a quarter of the value of the eye aim control. So again, the same thing we did with the single pupil controller from Rig 1, we're just doing it now with two separate pupil controls for the right and left. Okay, let's also hook up our individual pupil control. So I'm going to select the eye layer, I'm going to lock the effect control window, and we're going to grab the position of the left pupil and grab that property pick whip and connect that to that point controller. So we also have our individual pupil control. So now we have all the same eye aim control and individual pupil control we had with Rig 1. The difference now, of course, is that everything is still parented down to this squash and stretch null, which will now allow us to create squash and stretch that'll affect this entire eye rig. So the first thing we need to do is create a squash and stretch animation for this eye. So let's select the squash and stretch null. Let's hit the S key for scale. And because we created this null with the Duick controller creator, we have to first delete the lock on the value there, just like we did before. If you want to avoid that step, you can just create a null with the layer controller. And then we'll create a simple animation where, again, the neutral value will be at 10. And then the squash will be here at frame 0. And we're going to use 150 and 50 for the squash. And then the stretch at frame 20 will be the opposite, 50 and 150. Now we have our nice squash and stretch animation with neutral right in the middle. Let's select our eye aim control, hit the E key, and we're going to tab open the left squash and stretch slider. Let's select that slider, go into our connector, choose that as our master property, set our minimum value at -100, maximum value at 100, and then select our animation and connect to properties. Now we have this super cool squash and stretch control for each individual eye, so we can create some really fun, expressive poses with our eyes. They can pop open in surprise, they can squint with suspicion, they can have open lids or closed lids or half open lids. We've really got a lot of ability now to pose these eyes in many, many different ways. Okay, let's go ahead and do our cleanup. Let's lock up all of our layers within our head pre-comp. and we can close that head pre-comp layer. Let's also make sure that we lock back up our head comp here and shy our layers away and unlock our effects control window. So we've got some terrific control over our eyes here. Spend a little time playing around with both of these rigs and see how many different facial expressions you can come up with. This second rig in particular, you'll find very, very expressive with that additional squash and stretch control. Now, both the characters we've been working with in these eye lessons have had eyes without a lot of sense of perspective to them. And that's made it easy to connect up these aim controls because we can basically have the pupils just move in tandem along with the aim controllers without any trouble. But some cartoon characters have eyes with a really strong sense of perspective. So the eyes are really different sizes or even different shapes. In that case, having the pupils move in tandem with the controller can cause problems. So let's take a look at an example of that and how you can solve it. So if you go to the lopsided eyes rig, we just have a simple kind of setup here with exactly what I'm talking about. We've got a larger eye in front here and then a smaller eye giving us a sense of perspective behind it. And this is a pretty common thing with 2D characters. Now again, imagine if we moved both pupils the same distance. By the time this pupil reached the top of this eye, this pupil would be probably buried up here somewhere. Or if this pupil was up at the top of this eye, this pupil wouldn't quite be there yet. Same with the sides. And the more lopsided the eyes, the more difficult this problem would become. So in this case, it's not going to work to simply connect the pupil movements right to the aim control directly. So in this case, we have to have a more sophisticated connection between the movements of the pupils and the movement of the eye aim control. And for this, we're once again going to use our awesome connector tool. So let's dig into this a little and see how this works. I've got it partially set up for you guys to save a little time. So let's unshy our layers and let's unlock our head comp here and double click on it. And let's take a look at what we have here. We have pupils and eye whites. We've got eye white mats in place already to keep the pupils inside the eye whites. And note that we've got the pupils already parented to null objects, a null for the right and a null for the left. Now in this case, we are parenting these pupils to nulls so we can put our connector rigging on these nulls and then still add individual pupil control to the pupil artwork layers. It's always a good idea to try to get that individual pupil control worked into your rig. Now note that we've got sets of animation on these pupil nulls. Let's focus on the right one here. Now if you look, you'll see that if I just scrub through the animation, I just get this diagonal movement, which seems kind of odd. But note that we've split our position values into X and Y. So what we're really seeing here are two separate animations, one for the X position and one for the Y position. Let's real quick kind of take a look at how this works. So I'm going to temporarily drag the Y animation away, and I'm going to copy and paste our middle neutral keyframe, slide that back and put a hold on it, just so we're not moving the Y position for a minute. And let's take a look at the X movement. So at frame 10, we are in our neutral position. At frame 0, we're looking to one side. And at frame 20, we're looking to the other side. And what's nice about this is that we can precisely control the extremes of this movement. So if this wasn't far enough, I could actually pull this out farther if I wanted it to go farther or not as far. It's really up to you, but you're essentially creating a limit for how far this eye can move within the eye white. Now we've got exactly the same situation for the Y value. So again, let's slide the X animation out of the way. Let's copy and paste that neutral. And here you can see we've got an extreme at the bottom and an extreme at the top with our neutral in the middle, just exactly the same situation. Now when these are together, they just create this kind of diagonal movement. But we're going to use the connector to tie this to our aim control. So the X movement moves the X animation and the Y movement moves the Y animation and functions basically like any aim controller would. It's just going to hit these limits as we push that aim controller up and down and back and forth. Now we've done exactly the same thing with the left eye. And what that means is when we push, for example, the aim control all the way up in Y, both of these eyes are going to hit their limits at the top of the eye, or if we push it all the way to one side or another in X, they're going to hit their limits. So the pupils are going to appear to move in tandem, even though one eye is bigger and one eye is smaller. Now you can also use this technique if you just like the idea of a limitation. With our previous two rigs, you can move the pupils way beyond where they actually would be within those eyes. So if you like the idea of limiting the movement so you can only push the pupils so far, you can also use this technique for that, whether you have lopsided eyes or not. So let's set this up with our connector. So let's go back into our lopsided eyes rig comp here. Let's select our eye aim control and we'll hit the P key to open that zeroed out position. We're going to select that position value. We're going to go into our connector here and we're going to choose that as the master property. So our master property now, rather than being a slider or any other effect control, is simply the position property of this layer. And this is one of the really powerful things about the connector. Any property can be a master property, and it can control any set of animation. So because we've selected a position value, note that we now have the option to choose the axis. So we're going to start with the x-axis, which is the default. Now, the minimum and maximum value on the property, we're going to have to sort of guess at first. But luckily, Duik makes it possible to change this after the rigging is completed. So we can start with just a good guess here. So let's try a minimum of -100 and a maximum of 100. That'll be from the 0 here in the position. So we want to make sure that these are equal to either side of 0. So -200, 200, -50 to 50, so that 0 is our neutral in the middle. But we'll just guess on -100, 100 for now and see how that feels. And then we just need to go into our head comp and select our X-axis animation on both layers, and then connect to properties. Now let's do the same with the Y value. Now we don't have to re-pick our position property that's already selected for our connector here. All we have to do is change the axis to Y, and then we need to reverse the minimum and maximum. Because we have the pupil down on the first frame and up on the last frame. And of course, in terms of Y values in After Effects, up is negative and down is positive. So let's just reverse these and we'll make this 100 and then -100. And again, we can adjust these later once the rigging is done. Then we need to select our Y property animation and connect to properties. Now let's go back to our rig comp, and now you can see that as we move our controller around, it moves those pupils together, but they stay perfectly within those eye whites, and when we go all the way up, they both go up. When they go down, they both go down, side to side, so they work together as this controller moves around despite their difference in size. Now, as I said before, if you just like the idea of this limitation that we have here, you could use this even if your eyes are not lopsided. Now, as I play with this, it's moving a little too much for my taste. It's kind of really jumping around there without a lot of movement, so it's hard to control. So let's increase the minimum and maximum. You can see on the position connectors here that I can change the minimum and maximum value at will even after the rigging has taken place. This is a really nice feature of the connector. So let's turn these minimum and maximums up a little bit, just like we did when we tuned the expression when we directly connected position to position with the pick whip. So I'm not going to go as far as quarter this, but I am going to knock it down by about a third. So let's go to minus 300 and 300, 300 and minus 300. Let's give that a try. Oh yeah, that feels a lot better. That feels much more intuitive. So another example of the great power of the connector, the ability to allow any property to drive any animation, is very, very powerful. And the fact that with a position or a scale value, you can choose different animations to be driven by the X and Y axis gives you even greater flexibility and control. I think the connector is one of the coolest things about Duick-Basel. All right, let's finish this rig up by adding our individual pupil control. Notice I've already added point controllers here. So we just need to lock our effect control window, go into the head comp. Let's unlock our pupil layers, our pupil artwork layers, open their position values. And what we need to do first is zero these out. So let's select each pupil in turn and zero these out. And then we can use our property pick whips to tie these in. Now we have our awesome aim control, but we also have the ability to control each pupil individually, so we can make cross eyes or crazy eyes. And the cool thing is that, look, our aim control still works even when we've goofed up the eyes with our individual controls. Let's lock up all of our layers here, close our window, lock our head comp, and shy this away, unlock our effect control window. Always good to try to keep up with your cleanup steps as you go. Then you'll have less to clean up once you're done with your whole rig. All right, we've looked at how to create simple aim controls and blink controls for simple button or dot eyes. And now we've learned how to work with more complex eyes with separate pupils and eye whites and eyelids. We've added squash and stretch control to really push the expressive capability of our eyes. And we've even looked at how you can manage lopsided eyes by using the connector to create limits on the movement of each pupil. In our next lesson, we'll move on to looking at other aspects of the face, the eyebrows and the mouth. I'll see you then.